Thank you for joining me today. This is the Bold Lines podcast, and I am your host, Travis Thompson. Today, we're going to be talking about the fuel for sickness behind the screen. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of a warning here that this is going to be a rant. And if this is your first time listening to one of my episodes, you might be caught off guard. But for those that have been listening for a little while, the word rant is something people might find a little more comfortable. That's kind of the whole idea of the podcast. But I'm still going to give that warning nonetheless. I'm also going to say that some of the things I'm going to talk about are things that I struggle with myself. This isn't coming from a holy high chair or a high horse. Well, some of it will be. But for the most part, these are things that I also struggle with in today's modern world. Today's episode is the interplay between screen time and mental health. Obviously, the types of screens that we use matters, and what we use them for certainly matters. Someone who is scrolling through their email to do work is going to have different effects on their brain than someone who is doom scrolling through social media. We're going to go ahead and acknowledge that up front because it's important to make that kind of distinction. Now, screen time over the years has drastically increased. Social media and our phones have only gotten more complex and more inviting. This is one of those times when I start to sound like the quote unquote old people, but back in my day, there was a time when surfing online was something reserved for a family computer. I'm a part of the generation that saw the world pre-widespread internet and post-widespread internet. So I still remember the time when phones were simply something that you called on and you texted in a very limited way. And internet use was something that we reserved for some personal interactions. Like if we wanted to send a couple emails or look up a funny video, that was something that had to be done on a family computer. So let's talk about how this has changed and where mental health can start to be affected. So one of the big differences between then and now is just how much is able to be accessed through a phone. I'm going to be primarily talking about phones today because those seem to be the biggest problem for the most people, although online games also tend to be an issue as well. But these phones have the ability to access information that originated on the other side of the world almost instantaneously. We have a constant influx of information that if we only give a small amount of effort to, we can find something new to dive into. The initial thought with all of this interconnection was to assume that everyone would be more connected. Surely, if they had instantaneous and easy access, that would make things a whole lot more communal, a whole lot more friendly and inviting. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. There's this interesting interplay where we can have an ease of access to someone, but the easier it is to access them, the less likely we are to have more intentional interactions with that person. Now, for those of you that are a little bit younger listening to this might seem like an odd concept because as a therapist, I work with people that are younger and people that are older. And for people that are younger, this is how they've always interacted with their friends and with their loved ones. For those that are older, we can remember the interconnection of always meeting up. And so there's going to be a little bit of a disconnect in all of that. But the important thing here for mental health is that isolation that I was hinting to before. Just because everyone is easy to access, it doesn't mean that we actually feel connected to them. And if we do, it doesn't really mean all that much. There's a great saying that I once thought was really annoying, but I actually have come to appreciate, and it came from my father. And that is, in social media, you are comparing your bloopers to other people's highlight reels. Now, if that didn't make entirely that much sense, I'll reiterate it in a way that might be a little more palatable. The idea is With this interconnection, we can start to, quote unquote, look into people's lives. But the way that we do that is entirely manufactured and curated. We compare our insecurities, we compare the things that we struggle with to the seemingly perfect lives we find online. And this is where this first impact of mental health comes from. We can look online to the people that we seem to admire or even idolize, and we can see them and assume that that must be their entire life. Of course, we conveniently forget about things like Photoshop and color correction. But these social media impacts where we compare ourselves to people who might even have an entire team behind them to get the perfect photo can cause us to create this unhealthy comparison. Now, this isn't just seen in body image, although that seems to be the most commonly accepted version of this. This can also be in our relationships. I'm probably going to have another episode at another time about how social media has impacted our relationships and how we interact with one another. But for now, it's important to know that the way that we compare ourselves to other people has a huge impact. Another way that screen time is affecting our mental health is through dopamine hits. I mean, sit and think about it. When you have a phone in front of you, you can access almost whatever you want instantaneously and without much recourse. It's not that difficult. If there's something that would interest you, whether it's a funny video or even porn, you can find it really quickly and most of the time for free. This lends to very easy dopamine hits whenever you want and without much effort. That trains our brains in a very problematic way to where this wonderful chemical dopamine, this feel-good chemical, starts to get hijacked because what we're getting it from doesn't actually require any sacrifice or effort. I mean, technically speaking, all you have to do is move your thumb a couple times and you can have a dopamine hit. It doesn't really require that much effort. But what does all of this have to do with mental health? The first thing it does is it orients ourselves to becoming very isolated and independent. Now, I mentioned that before, but with these dopamine hits, we can kind of get this false sense of appreciation for life. We can start to feel content, when in reality, all we're getting are these cheap, short dopamine hits through social media, through the news, and all these other ways that we can interact online. But how is this seen in specific mental health? Besides just the comparison's sake, I'll give you something that I've found that's really interesting. When therapists work with clients that are especially younger, we talk about a lot of things that could impact their mental health, like their friend group, school, family. But I've found that most therapists don't actually ask about social media usage, how much time kids spend on their phones. Now, again, I'm trying not to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but come on, you have to see it at this point. There's a video that I saw, and I can't even remember exactly where I saw it, where kids were comparing their screen time, and there were some kids that were talking about 10, 11 hours a day, which is wild, considering most people's friends are right in front of them while they're on the phone. And again, I know that I struggle with this too, but that's the point of this episode. So most therapists don't even ask about social media usage, let alone what kind of social media the kids are using. Now, if you're not privy to old internet, the times when the internet was just budding, you might not be aware of websites like Tumblr. Now, Tumblr was an interesting website. It got overrun with tons of porn. It was a whole mess. But there was something that was really interesting. This website, Tumblr, was kind of like a blog, but what it fostered was this ability for a whole bunch of people who struggled with mental health to identify with one another. Now, this wasn't a support group scenario. They weren't actually pushing towards anything. What they were actually doing was starting to glorify their mental health. I remember a time when I looked up a news article where there was almost a sense of praising eating disorders almost until they were talking about entities. Like I remember specifically Somebody was talking about being thankful for Mia as if it was a person, but really they were talking about bulimia, which was completely wild to learn. But as much as that might sound shocking to you, we get something very similar on things like YouTube and TikTok. Again, I'm going to try to not sound too argumentative about this, but I absolutely despise TikTok. Not because of everything involved with how safe it is as an app, but how much it glorifies mental health disorders. Here's the absolutely crazy thing is that over the years, I've started to see more and more teenagers come and tell me the mental health problem they're struggling with. Then my follow-up question is, well, have you seen a therapist before? Have you seen a psychologist? And they say, no, but I have all the symptoms. And it doesn't take too long for them to really let go and say, oh yeah, well, I saw this on TikTok or YouTube, which I'm all for advocacy, but come on. There's no way anybody can diagnose themselves from a short clip. And it's not just that kids nowadays are seeing these clips, but they're also researching disorders where they could start to identify themselves with the whole community in which that community might not even exist in the way that they think. I mean, let's just go to one of the most obvious ways that this is seen nowadays. There's this diagnosis called dissociative identity disorder. It was originally known as multiple personality disorder. I've worked with it. It is incredibly complex and difficult to work with. And you have to tread very lightly so that you don't misunderstand or misrepresent things. But you can go on TikTok right now. You can pull off of this podcast. You can pause and go look at DID podcasts where you have these people who say they have all of these different members of a system. And here's the crazy thing. Most of them are lying. How would I know that? Well, the research tells us you probably don't have 30 people inside your head. There's specific roles that DID members of a system work through. Now, getting into the nitty-gritty of what this is a whole other topic in itself, but you can have people who have looked into something like DID so intricately that they can begin to tell themselves that, oh my gosh, that's what I'm thinking. And so instead of it just being an informational endeavor, it becomes a self-identifying behavior. You can also see this in a ton of different ways and a ton of different identities where it's almost like a free-for-all. Now, a screen isn't just something that amuses you. It's something that can help you identify yourself. And I know that I'm stepping into a little hot water here, but there are so many things that just appeared out of nowhere, largely due to the effect that social media and the internet has had. Now, to what level of contagion, I think is up to debate, is up to research, but I can't imagine anybody nowadays saying that they would disagree with just how widespread some of this stuff has become simply because of social media. Now, I don't want to make this entire episode about social media, but we also have to recognize that there are so many people, even online, who fake mental health disorders for the sake of gaining attention. And that's one of the other big things that I think fuels sickness for clients and people who have never been to therapy. You can fake a mental disorder pretty convincingly and gain a ton of empathy and attention. Now, for anybody listening, please don't get on a train and start wondering if everyone who ever says they have a mental disorder really is making it up for attention. But it's there. Again, I saw another video of people faking something like Tourette's, which if anybody who's actually worked with Tourette's or has it themselves would be able to see rather quickly, but because of the effect of the internet, it didn't matter until people like that are actually outed and they end up leaving a trail of information to show that they are making it up. But here's the wild thing. It doesn't actually matter all that much. Because of our phones in front of us, we can create this online community that doesn't actually exist. We can reinforce things and quote unquote give support to one another through likes, through comments. I would argue it's a bunch of garbage. Nobody was actually supported through comments and likes and shares. They get dopamine hits. They get short bits of euphoria that don't actually amount to anything. It's just a short hit that ends up making you feel worse, so you have to go back and do it again. So for anybody out there that says that they have an online community that supports them, I would say, no, you don't. You just have a bunch of people who feel like they can support you because they have a phone. I doubt any of them actually are involved in your life. That if you had a flat tire, that they would either show up and help you change it or call AAA. You just have a bunch of people who are positive because it's easy. Now, this might seem like it's a purely let's hate on young people, but let me pivot to another end of this. There's also this interesting phenomenon called echo chambers in social media and in media in general. Now, here's the interesting thing. Because the internet is mostly concerned about keeping you online and engaged, many companies have come to understand that it doesn't exactly matter how accurate the information they're putting out is, as long as it keeps you invested. And this is where I transition from younger people to older people. Because, my goodness, if anybody's seen the news nowadays, it seems like the world is falling apart. It's absolutely astounding how many times the world is ending, how many times a presidency is going to ruin everything, how many times a country has invaded, and how many times the gas prices are going to skyrocket, so you better stockpile it. Yeah, the news has the same impact. You get little dopamine hits. You get an entire community of people who, quote unquote, reinforce and support one another when in reality, nothing's actually happened. For anyone who is sharing news all the time or knows someone who is, they've suffered the same contagion that a lot of young people are criticized for. Why would you share news about a president's recent interactions or all of these dumb things that really don't matter? They're asking for the same dopamine hits that young people are. And even worse, these are the same people who go and argue online about really trivial things. A whole bunch of things that don't actually matter, but where does that come from? Remember, I said companies want to keep you engaged. It's actually one of the big ways that they make money. And so what they do is they take these little microscopes or these magnifying glasses, and they look on these small points of interaction. And they hyper-focus on them so it seems like this one thing is happening everywhere. I'm sure over the years, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, many people have seen a huge divide in this country. Now, here's an interesting thing. A small minority makes up the vast majority of online presence through influence. Now, I'm not going to get on an influencer train, but this is kind of how it works. There's a small group of people that is the loudest. And so if you were to just take in your assumption of human interaction online, you're going to think everybody hates each other. I would encourage you to go outside. Go touch grass. That's one of my favorite phrases in all of this. If you really think everybody hates each other, why don't you go talk to someone at the grocery store? Now, are there going to be hateful people? Sure. Are there going to be people who are more divided? Sure. But for the most part, things are much the same. Yes, things cost more. I get that. But if you were to only be online, your anxiety would be heightened. And this is one of the big ways that I think a lot of people are caught for sickness behind a screen is we've become so enveloped in a computer screen or a TV or our phones that we've started to look at the world around us as this huge, hateful endeavor to try to ruin us and the people we care about. I've actually heard a wonderful term that I really like for the news. It's fear porn. Now, that might be a little bit of a harsh term, but I wholeheartedly stand behind it. The news, if it's on TV, if it's on TikTok or YouTube or whatever it is most of the time just fear porn. Much like actual porn, it's a bastardization of what actually happens. No porn is real, okay? It's all set up and there are crews involved. And much like the news, most of it isn't real. There are crews involved, and things are edited and marketed a certain way. So for anyone who has realized that their own screen time could be affecting their mental health, here's some ways that I will let you know that is really common. I mentioned the first before, anxiety. Well, no duh. If you're looking around everywhere and you think everything's falling apart and you have embraced the Chicken Little ideology, of course you're going to be anxious. You could also feel depressed. I mean, if you look around and the world's falling apart and everyone hates you, you might feel a sense of feeling lost or that there's nothing else to do. You could also find yourself being impulsive. If you look at the world around you and you see that the next dangerous thing is just on the horizon, you might make decisions that aren't very realistic. You could also restrict relationships. And while this isn't a direct mental health diagnosis, it certainly affects it. If you have this assumption that the world is so divided, you might cut yourself off from people who could actually help you grow. Which, goodness, that's how we grow, is we hear opposing viewpoints. And this is not a partisan thing. I mean, goodness, we see people scream at each other online at someone they'll never actually speak to in real life, but yes, they're not experts, but doggone it, they're going to act like it. And so for anybody who's listened to this whole thing today and says, I'm going to be done with the news, I'm going to be done with social media, look, it's not the point of all of this. The point is how to look at all of these things and how it could be impacting you and the people you care about. Is the news a good thing? Yes, we should know about what's happening in the world. I would hope from a more objective perspective, though. That would be more focused on the literal events that are happening and not how some pundit can take a small story and spin it into an hour-long dramatic conversation with 5 other people. So yes, the news is a good thing. We should know what's happening, even if it's just to be more culturally and worldly aware of what's going on. Can social media be a good thing? Absolutely. It's a way to be able to stay connected to some degree with people we care about. People organize events or fundraisers because of social media. I don't think it's inherently a bad thing. But nowadays, screens have become addictive. And it's not just about tools anymore. It's about how you can be brought into such a severe degree that your own mental health suffers, some other company or some other group or interest gets to make literal money off of you losing your mental health. Now, I'm going to repeat that again in a slightly different way in case you didn't catch it. But our mental health is struggling across the board simply because we won't relegate our time on media and social media, and so that some companies can make money off of our rage engagement. That's it. That's the whole purpose of all of this. If you want to help your mental health, this is one of the first things that I talk about with my clients is get off of media for a little while. Go touch grass. Go talk to people. If you're afraid to talk to people, that means you should probably do it. I would obviously recommend start with people who are nice, but you would be shocked how many clients I have who, once they stopped being on social media, so much of their ideology, so much of their personal identity and anxiety floats away because they realize that Twitter isn't a real place. It's just a whole bunch of people putting on a mask for the sake of getting other people's approval and attention. So what do we do with this? If you find yourself struggling, feeling anxiety or depression or impulsivity or concern when you are on media, you should take that into account. If you are someone who spends a ton of media on something like video games, you can also suffer in this way from lack of actual intimate connection and really intense, quick dopamine hits. If you've wondered if you have one of these basic quote unquote disorders, remove media from your life as much as you possibly can. Give it a month or two and see if all of that goes away. I would argue for most people, they would feel a whole lot better if they stepped away for a while. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you got something that could be useful for you, something that could be helpful for you to consider and maybe even share to your loved ones. If you feel so inclined, you can leave a tip so that I can pay out the producer and keep these episodes going. If not, I hope that you subscribe to the podcast and share it with those around you so they can receive a little bit of hope and help as well.